June 28, 1945, Southern Colorado. The war in Europe was over, but the air still carried its ghost. The high plains of the American West trembled beneath the morning wind, sweeping across fields of buffalo grass and red dust. The mountains to the west were pale blue with distance, their peaks scarred with snow even in summer. A freight truck rattled along a dirt road, its olive paint faded and its tires throwing up a storm of dust that smelled faintly of sage and gasoline. Inside, 12 young women sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, German prisoners of war bound not for punishment but for something stranger, something they could not yet name. They had crossed an ocean they had never seen, to a land they could not imagine. Most had expected the camps to be brutal, like the ones they'd heard whispered about in Europe. But when the truck slowed, rounding a bend to reveal rows of long, low wooden barracks ringed with barbed wire and framed by the Rocky Mountains, what they saw instead was sunlight, and horses grazing in the distance. A flag moved in the dry air, the stars and stripes bright against the blue. And beneath it, a silence too wide to measure. Ilse Müller was 22. She sat near the back, a folded Red Cross blanket in her lap. Her fingers were raw from the voyage, not from labor but from nerves. Only months earlier she had tapped out messages for the Luftwaffe in the ruins of Cologne, relaying coordinates until Allied shells silenced her unit for good. Now she was here, in a land she had only read about in schoolbooks that called it the frontier. She didn't know it yet, but she would never see Germany again. The guards at Camp Trinidad were older men, many of them veterans of the last war. They wore soft expressions, faces weathered by wind more than by hatred. There were no shouted orders that first day, only a kind of weary coordination, paperwork, uniforms, the cataloging of personal items. The women were housed separately from the men, in a section the locals nicknamed the German village. Around them, the sounds of America drifted like another language. The creak of windmills, the clang of a screen door, the distant radio voices of baseball games and war bond announcements. For the people of Trinidad, the war had ended months ago. The front page no longer screamed about Berlin or Iwo Jima. Now it spoke of harvests, gasoline rations, and the return of local boys from France. The prisoners, though, arrived as living echoes of a conflict everyone wanted to forget. They looked just like us, one rancher would later recall. Only quieter. The heat rose in waves across the prairie. It baked the tin roofs of the barracks and turned the dust into fine red powder. Inside, the women learned the rhythms of captivity, roll call at dawn, work assignments by midday, lights out at 10. Yet, unlike the bleak camps of Europe, this place held something else, work that mattered. The U.S. government had repurposed the prisoners as laborers, a wartime necessity turned experiment in rehabilitation. Ilse and the others were assigned to a local ranch cooperative, tending horses, mending fences and harvesting sugar beets. The same hands that once handled codebooks and rifles now held reins and spades. That first night, Ilse stood at the fence line, the wire glinting silver in the moonlight. Beyond it stretched an ocean of grass, swaying like water under the starlight. She could hear the faint whinny of horses, the rumble of a train miles away, the whisper of a guard's cigarette. The camp seemed to breathe in its sleep. She thought of her family, her mother's small kitchen in Bremen, her brother's uniform folded on the chair, the hollow silence after the bombs. Here, in this vast American quiet, she felt something that frightened her more than captivity, peace. What she didn't know was that this camp, this dusty outpost on the edge of nowhere, would become one of the largest centers for the re-education of German prisoners in the United States. What began as labor would soon turn into language lessons, cultural exchanges, even music recitals. The men and women who came here as enemies would leave with new words, new friends, and for a few, new lives. The war had taken their nations, but it had also opened a door that none of them could have imagined. The first English lessons began under a cottonwood tree beside the stables. A volunteer teacher from the University of Colorado, a woman named Margaret Hayes, came twice a week with a box of chalk and a smile that did not flinch. She was 29, the widow of a bomber pilot lost over France. The prisoners respected her instantly, not out of pity but out of something like awe. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if language itself could heal a wound. "This is a horse," she said, pointing. "Das ist ein Pferd," Ilse whispered back. The word hung between them, fragile and alive. That was how it began. Words traded across barbed wire like small acts of faith. By August, the camp's work crews were helping on neighboring ranches. The locals, hesitant at first, found themselves surprised by the discipline of their new laborers. The prisoners repaired fences, hauled hay, even broke wild mustangs brought down from the high country. For Ilse, it was a transformation. The code operator became a rider. Each morning she saddled a chestnut mare the Americans called Liberty and rode out under the burning sun, dust curling around her boots, her laughter startling the cattle. From above, the land looked endless, flat plains stitched to the horizon, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising like a wall of blue stone. To those who came from the ruins of Europe, it felt like another planet. Here there were no sirens, no rubble, no orders shouted through smoke. There was only the pulse of the land, wind through dry grass, the thud of hooves, the hum of cicadas. In the evenings, the guards sometimes played music on a crackling phonograph. The prisoners listened from their barracks, swing songs, church hymns, fragments of a language that was slowly becoming theirs. History would later describe Camp Trinidad as part of a pragmatic post-war effort, an agricultural workforce, an experiment in humane internment. But inside those fences, the truth was simpler and more profound. It was a place where strangers worked side by side, where an enemy was no longer a face in a propaganda poster but a person. Sunburned, tired, hungry, laughing at the same small jokes. It was a strange kind of redemption, born not from politics but from proximity. By September, the first letters home were allowed. Ilse wrote on U.S. Army stationery, her handwriting small and deliberate. Mother. The land is vast and bright. The people are not cruel. We ride horses and learn English. The word for Heimat here is home. I'm not sure I remember what ours looked like. She folded the page carefully, sealing it with the faintest trace of hope. What she didn't know was that, years later, historians would call this camp one of the quiet turning points in post-war reconciliation. A moment when America, weary from victory, chose mercy over vengeance. What she didn't know was that the friendships forged here, across wire and language and loss, would ripple outward, shaping lives long after the headlines had faded. In the late light of that first autumn, Ilse stood once more at the fence line. Beyond it, the horses grazed in the amber grass, their shadows long and unbroken. The sky burned orange, then violet, then deepened into the color of ash. Somewhere a radio played a waltz. She closed her eyes and let the wind carry the sound. East, across the plains, across the ocean, back to the ruins of a continent still trying to understand what it had done to itself. In that moment, quiet, unremarkable, unseen, something shifted. The war was not gone, not yet. But its weight had begun to lift, if only slightly. The girl who had once listened for orders in the static of a ruined city now listened for the breath of a horse, the rustle of grass, the slow heartbeat of a land that was teaching her how to live again. She didn't know it yet, but this would be her last winter as a prisoner. And when the gates finally opened, she would not walk back through them. The turning point. Camp Trinidad, Colorado, autumn 1945. The days shortened. The air grew thin with the scent of snow. Across the plains, wind carried the smell of hay, iron, and the faint sweetness of molasses from the feed barns. The war had ended 6 months ago, but inside the camp, time still moved by military rhythm. Reveille, roll call, labor, silence. For Ilse Müller, the calendar no longer marked history. It marked habit. She rose before dawn each morning, laced her boots, and waited for the truck that carried her and 6 other women out past the wire, down a dirt road that led toward the ranchlands. There, among the open fields, she felt something close to freedom. The horses didn't ask about the past. They only responded to tone, to movement, to patience, things that the war had nearly stripped from her. Margaret Hayes, the teacher, the widow, met them at the ranch twice a week. She had begun not only to teach them English, but also to read to them. Steinbeck, Dickinson, Whitman. Her voice was calm and deliberate, weaving through the air like a quiet prayer. Ilse listened, understanding only fragments at first: hope, freedom, grace, words that felt heavier than the work she did. "You learn a language to survive," Margaret told them one morning, her breath visible in the cold. "But you speak it to be understood." Ilse nodded, even if she didn't fully understand yet. In November, snow fell across the camp, soft as ash. The landscape transformed. Fences became ghostly lines under frost, the horses' breath steaming in the morning light. The women worked in heavy coats, their laughter muffled by scarves. For the first time in years, Ilse's hands ached not from fear but from cold. It was an honest pain. The guards grew less rigid as winter deepened. They shared coffee, cigarettes, sometimes even a word or two of broken German. One of them, Sergeant Tom Avery, often watched Ilse when she rode. He was 32, quiet, a veteran of North Africa. He rarely spoke, but his eyes followed the horses like someone remembering another life. It was Avery who first asked the ranch foreman to let Ilse take charge of training a half-wild bay mare that no one could ride. The horse, they said, was mean as a storm, untouchable. But Ilse didn't see anger in the animal, she saw terror. For weeks she worked with it slowly, whispering, stepping close, then backing away. One morning the others watched in silence as she placed her hand on its neck. The mare trembled but didn't bolt. That afternoon, Avery said softly, almost to himself, "Guess even a wild thing learns to trust again." No one answered him, but Ilse heard it. And something in her heart cracked open like ice. Historians note. During 1945 to 1946, the U.S. operated over 500 prisoner-of-war camps across the country. Camp Trinidad became known for its humane treatment and educational programs. Many prisoners, men and women, were allowed to work on local farms and ranches, earning small stipends and often forging friendships with Americans. This approach, radical at the time, laid early groundwork for post-war reconciliation efforts. Spring returned to Colorado with wind and color. The snow melted into the earth, feeding the fields with muddy promise. Ilse's English had improved. She could now read simple sentences, even write short letters for others in her barracks. In the evenings the women would sit outside, swapping words they'd learned: sky, saddle, forgiveness. But peace like spring came unevenly. Inside her, memories lingered: the bombing of Bremen, the screams in the rubble, the faces of boys she'd helped guide to death with her coded transmissions. At night she dreamed of voices and static. Feinde Anflug. Enemy approaching. Sometimes she woke with her hand outstretched, as if trying to turn down a radio that no longer existed. Margaret noticed. One day while Ilse cleaned tack in the barn, she spoke quietly. "You can't carry a war forever, Ilse," she said. "It will make a prisoner of you even when the gates are open." Ilse looked up, her hands trembling. She wanted to answer, but there was no word, not in German, not in English, for the kind of guilt that survived survival. By June 1946, word spread that repatriation orders were coming. The U.S. government would begin sending prisoners home within the year. To most, it was news of relief, to return, to rebuild, to see family. But for Ilse it brought dread. Germany was still in ruins. Her family's letters had stopped months ago. She imagined streets without roofs, faces without names. And there was something else, a feeling she could not confess even to herself. She had begun to love this place. The vastness, the smell of rain on dust, the rhythm of the horses, even the quiet voice of Sergeant Avery when he said her name, carefully, as though afraid it might break. "Ilse," he'd said one evening, handing her a cup of coffee. "You ever think about what comes next?" She hesitated. "For me there is only before and after." In July the camp hosted what the locals called the Peace Fair. It was meant as a gesture of goodwill before the departures began. Music, food, and a small rodeo where the POWs demonstrated their ranch work. American flags fluttered beside hand-painted German ones. Children from the town ran along the fences, waving. For a moment the war felt like a rumor. When Ilse's turn came, she rode Liberty, the same chestnut mare from the previous summer. She guided the horse through a short course of barrels and ropes, her posture straight, her movements fluid. The crowd cheered, though she barely heard them. What she felt instead was the pulse of the earth through the hooves, the sound of wind through the grass, a heartbeat shared between two living things, free only because they trusted each other. Afterward, Avery approached her with a letter. "Orders came," he said. "You'll ship out in 2 weeks." "To Germany?" "Yeah. Bremen sector." Her stomach turned. Bremen, the city of ashes. She looked down at her hands, still gloved with dust. "There is nothing left there," she whispered. Avery said nothing. He simply looked toward the horizon, where the mountains met the sky. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But sometimes the hardest thing is going back to what's left." The days that followed were heavy with indecision. Ilse packed her few belongings: a Bible given by Margaret, a folded American flag she'd helped mend, a photograph of the camp horses. But every time she thought of leaving, she felt the land pull at her like gravity. Then came the storm. A freak thunderhead swept down from the Rockies one night, tearing through the plains with violent rain and lightning. One of the corrals broke under the wind, and the horses bolted into the darkness. Alarms sounded across the camp. Ilse, hearing the chaos, ran from her barracks before the guards could stop her. She found Liberty near the edge of the property, tangled in wire, panicking. Without thinking, she climbed the fence, ignoring the shouted orders. "Get back," someone yelled. "She's tangled," Ilse cried back. She cut her hands, freeing the horse, blood mixing with rain and mud. Lightning split the sky, white, blinding. The horse broke free, and for a moment, Ilse stood in the open field, soaked and trembling, face turned upward to the storm. Avery reached her seconds later, pulling her away just as another bolt struck the ground yards away. Afterward, back in the infirmary, he said softly, "You could have been killed." "Then at least I'd have died doing something that mattered," she answered. He didn't argue. He just looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that says everything words can't. The next morning, word spread quickly. She had broken rules, left her quarters, crossed a security line. But instead of punishment, she was given quiet commendation. Bravery, they called it. Instinct. Something had shifted, not just in her but in how they saw her. The storm had destroyed half the fencing, and Ilse led the repair crews for days, her bandaged hands working without rest. It was there, hammering a post into the wet earth, that she made her decision. She would not go back. When repatriation began in 1946, many German POWs requested to stay in the U.S. Few were allowed. Some, however, found legal paths through sponsorship or marriage. These cases became symbolic of the quiet reconciliations that followed a century's bloodiest war. Ilse's chance came quietly. Margaret Hayes had written letters, one to the ranch cooperative, another to the War Department, arguing that Ilse's labor was essential to the local economy and that her reformation and loyalty to humane values warranted clemency. Avery co-signed the request. In late August the answer came. Approved. Civilian parole. Work permit granted. Release date, September 12, 1946. That morning, Ilse stepped through the same gate she had once entered in chains. The guards saluted. She nodded, unable to speak. Beyond the wire, the plains stretched endless and golden. Avery stood beside a truck loaded with feed. "Need a hand?" he asked. Ilse smiled, the first true smile in years. "Always." They drove toward the horizon, the sky widening, the fences receding behind them like a memory. History often remembers wars for their battles. But sometimes peace begins in smaller moments. In the hand that steadies a frightened horse. In the words spoken across a language once used for hate. In the silence between two people who choose not to be enemies anymore. What began as imprisonment had become something far more profound. In a world rebuilding from ashes, Ilse Müller, once a soldier of a defeated empire, had found the rarest kind of victory: forgiveness, freely given, and courage to accept it. She didn't know what her life would become. But she knew this. When the war ended, she had found a country that taught her how to be human again. And she would never go back. The legacy. Colorado, 1972. The wind over the plains hadn't changed. It still whispered across the dry grass in long sweeping sighs, carrying the smell of sage and dust, and the sound of fences humming in the distance. From the porch of a small ranch house outside Trinidad, a woman stood watching the horizon, her hands weathered, her hair streaked with silver. Her name was Ilse Avery, though it hadn't always been. 26 years earlier she had stood behind barbed wire, a prisoner of the country she now called home. In those years between, the land had shaped her the way wind shapes a canyon, slowly, invisibly, but completely. After the war, America released nearly all its German prisoners. Most went home to a nation in ruins, a place divided between guilt and hunger, shadowed by occupation. But a few stayed through circumstance or choice. Among them were the ranch hands, the laborers, the quiet ones who had seen kindness where they expected punishment. They stayed because something in the American earth, vast, indifferent, forgiving, offered a kind of peace that Europe no longer could. Ilse Müller was one of them. Her marriage to Tom Avery had not been a grand affair. No church bells, no parade. Just a small ceremony beneath the same cottonwood where she once learned her first English words. The war widow and the former prisoner. Together they rebuilt what the world had tried to break. In the early years life was hard. The drought of 1949 nearly ruined them. Their roof leaked, the fences broke, and there were nights when silence hung heavier than sleep. But Ilse knew hardship. It did not scare her. She rose each morning before dawn, mended tack, cooked breakfast, and rode beside Tom through the fields. Neighbors whispered at first, "The German woman," they said. But time has a way of dulling the edges of prejudice. By the 1950s, the Averys were simply Tom and Ilse, the couple who always waved from their truck, who gave free riding lessons to local children, who never missed the county fair. By the 1950s, the United States had quietly forgotten the German POW camps scattered across its heartland. The barracks were dismantled or left to rot, the watchtowers reclaimed by weeds. Yet their legacy lingered, in the small towns where former prisoners had returned as friends, in letters exchanged across oceans, and in the language of forgiveness that took root in unexpected places. Historians would later call it the peace of the plains. Ilse became a teacher at the local elementary school, not of history but of language. English for the children of Mexican and German immigrants who now populated the valley. Her students remembered her as patient, gentle, and firm, a woman whose accent carried the faint rhythm of two continents. When asked once why she chose to teach, she smiled and said, "Because language saved my life." Each word she spoke was a bridge, not between nations but between people. Between past and present. Between what was lost and what could still be built. In 1959, Ilse returned to Germany for the first time. The ship crossed the Atlantic under calm skies. She traveled to Bremen, her hometown, where her mother's house was gone, replaced by a vacant lot and a tangle of wild grass. The city was quiet, rebuilt but haunted. She walked the streets like someone visiting another lifetime. She found her brother's name etched into a memorial stone outside a church, Lieutenant Karl Müller, 1922 to 1944. She traced the letters with her fingertips and whispered the word she had once feared, Frieden. But it wasn't the peace of triumph. It was the peace of acceptance. Sometimes, she wrote in her journal that night, the hardest forgiveness is not for others but for oneself. When she returned to Colorado, she brought only a handful of soil from Bremen. She poured it quietly into the earth behind her house, beneath the same cottonwood tree that had shaded her first lesson in English. Germany meets America, she said softly. Past meets present. History remembers battles by their cost. But it often forgets the cost of peace. The peace that must be rebuilt, one human at a time. For Ilse, that rebuilding took place not in treaties or monuments, but in classrooms, on horseback, in the quiet labor of every sunrise. She carried no flag. She won no medals. But she taught dozens of children who went on to serve, to farm, to write, to dream. And in each of them was a fragment of her story, a living testament to the idea that compassion can be stronger than war. The 1960s brought new turbulence, Vietnam, civil rights, a changing world. Ilse watched the news on a small black and white television in her living room, the sound turned low. Once, during a broadcast about anti-war protests, she said softly to her husband, "They will have to learn the same lesson we did, that every war ends, but the people must live with what remains." Her eyes were tired but not bitter. She had learned that history repeats its pain until someone chooses not to. In the final years of her life, Ilse returned often to the ranch stables. The horses were older, slower like her. Yet when she placed her hand on their necks, they still recognized her touch. She had outlived the camp, the war, and nearly everyone who had known her as a prisoner. Every so often visitors came, historians, journalists, students, asking about the German woman who stayed. She answered them politely but always with the same humility. It wasn't bravery, she said. It was belonging. In the decades after World War II, stories like Ilse Avery's became rare footnotes in the larger narrative of victory and reconstruction. Yet they offered something vital, evidence that even in the wreckage of ideology, humanity endures. In 1985, a documentary crew visited Trinidad to interview surviving residents who remembered the camp. They found Ilse's journals, filled with reflections written in both German and English, pages that spoke not of guilt, but of gratitude. One entry read, "America taught me that freedom is not the absence of walls. It is the presence of understanding." When she passed away in 1987, the community held a small memorial at the school where she taught. The local pastor read from Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season." Margaret Hayes's niece, herself now a teacher, spoke about Ilse's kindness, her quiet strength. The children she taught planted a new cottonwood sapling beside the old one, its roots curling deep into the same soil that had once held two worlds in conflict. Her gravestone was simple. Ilse Müller Avery, 1923 to 1987. She turned captivity into connection. Time smooths the rough edges of memory. The camp at Trinidad is gone now, its fences swallowed by grass, its foundations crumbled to dust. But sometimes, when the wind moves through that valley, you can almost hear it. The echo of boots on wooden boards, the faint hum of an old phonograph, the soft laughter of a woman teaching herself to belong. History will always tell us how wars are won. But stories like hers remind us how peace is kept. Some men fight. Some build. Some forgive. And sometimes, the path that saves everything is the one you were never meant to take. Legacy statement. Sometimes peace is found not in treaties, but in the quiet work of forgiveness. Would you like me to format the entire three-part saga, the opening moment, the turning point, and the legacy, into a single cinematic narrative script suitable for voiceover or print publication, e.g., a Ken Burns-style documentary script?